Welcome everybody to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Homeowner webinar. This is a monthly webinar. We're so glad to have everybody here. So today I'm going to ask everybody as an icebreaker, where is your favorite part of your yard to sit outside and relax? Do you need a part of your yard to sit outside and relax? Is that why you're on this call? Or do you have a favorite part, or not this call, this webinar, or do you have like a favorite part that you really love to just sit? So I'll go first. I just revamped my front porch. I got some wind chimes. I got some new chairs, and I moved my houseplants around that are all in pots, and now it feels like a new porch. And somehow the sun isn't hitting me in the afternoon, and I've been sitting out there. Let's see what everybody. Gail, what about you? Would you have a spot that you like to sit outside?
I have a screened-in porch in the back, and I'm kind of up on a hill, so it gives me a nice view all the way down the hill and into a kind of wooded area. So that's my favorite spot.
Lovely. Okay, well, somebody Winter says that yes, she needs one, but it's too hot right now. I agree. I choose my moments in the shade. Marianne says is in Gainesville and has a backyard with beautiful natives and pollinators. Got a beautiful back patio, screen and porch. Oh boy. Teresa is sitting on her front porch, but being constantly attacked by mosquitoes. Ooh, we got some backyard under the trees for some dappled light. Somebody's building some benches in their garden soon. We got a pavilion. We have a back porch that overlooks roses and a hummingbird feeder. That's gorgeous. I have to admit, yeah, that's another thing too. We have a bunch of pollinator plants in my front yard. So that's a fun place to sit too and look for hummingbirds to come. Ooh, poolside. That sounds great. The front porch under the fan, of course, and the back porch observing birds and pollinators. Wow, we got a lot of responses here. Got a fish pond. That sounds great. Sounds like you guys have some wonderful outdoor space so far. Well, it is 11:03. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Wow, I guess I have some really nice spots. It's going on and on and on. I'm just looking at everybody's beautiful spots that they get to sit outside. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our webinar. This is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Monthly Homeowner Webinar. This is given every third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. My name is Claire Mitchell, and I am the Statewide Education Manager for FFL. And today we have Dr. Gail Hansen, who will speak with us about garden themes and styles, the key to creating your outdoor room. So first of all, your microphones have been muted. So if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. The chat box is going to be closed after this, and we're going to answer all your questions at the end of the presentation. So stick around and please till the end, because we have a little exit survey we'd love for you to take, and it helps us get an idea of what you liked about the presentation and what we can do better. Our next webinar is a special one. It is on September 16th at 11 a.m. and it is a Ask the Experts panel. So we're going to have Dr. Chris Marble, who's a professor in the Environmental Horticulture Department at the IFAS Mid-Florida Research Education Center. And he specializes in ornamental and landscape weed management. So any of your weed questions. We have Mark Frank. He's an extension botanist and associate collection manager at the UF Herbarium. And he specializes in plant identification, horticulture, and horticultural systematics. And Ralph Mitchell is the county extension director and a horticultural agent at IFAS Extension in Charlotte County. So if you have any questions that have been on your mind that you haven't gotten answered in some of the last webinars, go ahead. Let's come to this one with all your questions ready. Okay, finally, we are talking today with Dr. Gail Hansen. She's a professor in the Environmental Horticulture Department at UF, specializing in sustainable landscape design. Her teaching and extension programs focus on integrating science-based and art-centered landscape design practices that enhance urban green spaces, promote environmental protection, and improve the quality of life for urban residents. Dr. Hansen is affiliated with the UF IFAS Center for Land Use Efficiency, and that serves as an advisor to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, where she contributes as the extension specialist for landscape design. Gail, thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Claire. And thanks for the invitation to talk today. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the importance of using a theme or a style to create a nice garden design. And I wanted to talk about this because it's something that I require for all my students. I teach the residential landscape design classes here in the environmental hort department. And I have them choose a theme or a style when we start on a project because it is a very good roadmap to help them make decisions about their design as they are working on it. So I wanted to, first of all, give you a couple of examples. They're kind of extreme examples of using a theme. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between a theme and a style and how you can use that. So this photograph here that's on the first slide is a picture of a garden that I saw in a garden show in France. And it was a really great, fun garden show on a big estate with this big old castle. And it's, I think, done every 3 years. And they invite garden designers from all over the world to participate in this garden show. But one of the things that they have to do to participate is they have to write a narrative about what the theme of their garden is going to be. And they have to talk about, what the inspiration is and what it's going to look like with some sketches and what their style that they might use. And so this one in particular really caught my eye because, of course, it was really fun to walk on this boardwalk, curving boardwalk, but this was from a Japanese designer. So the theme that he had was a very contemporary take on a walk through a water garden with very tall reeds in the garden. And obviously it's not, real reeds, but it was his contemporary take on that. And so there were a lot of different examples in this particular garden show. And I wanted to show you another one too, real quick here. So this one here was a really fun one, especially for the kids, because it was, you can kind of tell, a take on Jurassic Park, only it was called Carnivore Park. And so they had displays with the carnivorous plants instead of dinosaurs or animals. And they showed the plants in cages, sort of like you would have seen maybe in Jurassic Park and in these areas with screens where you had to look at them, and they had signs all around that said, don't, stick your fingers in the cages and so forth. So it was a lot of fun. And it was obviously a very strong theme. I guess the style might be called contemporary also. But these are just two examples I wanted to start out with just to kind of inspire you and to think about themes for gardens. Obviously, these wouldn't be ones that you would use in your yard. Well, actually, maybe you might, I don't know. But so let's talk a little bit about garden themes and styles. So as I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to look back through some of my old garden design magazines, which I have, tons of them. And it was interesting because I came across several of them that actually talked about garden style. And the other fun thing about this was, as I looked at it, they always called it a special issue. Um, for example, the one about the power of garden style to shape your world. And the one in the middle, it was another special issue that talked about the spirit of garden style for a whole new way of living. And then another one was find your style with tips, on how to find your style and create those ultimate outdoor rooms. So that's what I'm going to talk about today is how to find your style and or your theme and use that to create those beautiful gardens and outdoor rooms. So here's another magazine cover that was on garden themes and talking about your themes that doing it your way in your garden and finding your style. And so the first thing I want to do is make the distinction between what is a theme and what is a style. So here you see a list of garden styles, and a garden style is establishes what the garden is going to look like. So what's going to be the visual aspect of that garden or the visual quality of it? And it's usually a garden that has a predetermined elements and a certain type of organization to it. So if you look at this list that I have below, the cottage garden, a Japanese or Asian garden, um, maybe a Spanish colonial, you could probably visualize in your head exactly what each of these gardens looks like, especially if you're like me and you go to a lot of garden shows or visit a lot of gardens or go to botanical gardens and so forth. Um, you can visualize in your head what these different gardens look like. Um, and so it's a particular style, usually based on a historical style or a cultural style, one from a certain time period, like the mid-century modern style, one from a region, like a tropical garden, a regional style. But all of them are very well defined, and you could identify it if you were looking through, a magazine. You could say, "Oh, that's a cottage garden or a Victorian garden." The difference between that and a garden theme is that the theme is based on a function and a form that you might want for your yard or your garden. So the form might be, very geometric, very formal with squares and circles, more straight lines. Or it might be naturalistic, so more organic, more informal, and less organized. It might be based on a favorite color that you have and having a lot of flowers or a different plant type. We've all seen grass gardens before, or cactus gardens, or fern gardens. Um, it might be based on the fact that you want it for entertainment, so you want it to be a very lively place, or relaxation, a very calm place. Uh, Others are like wildlife habitat. I know a lot of master gardeners and a lot of people are going for creating wildlife habitat or pollinator gardens, and it might be very traditional. So, for example, we have a traditional Florida-friendly landscape, um, which used to kind of be called the PUD landscape for planned unit development. And it's the one with more turf and your traditional foundation planting design. Or it could even be a very contemporary garden, something new, kind of what the latest trends are in gardens. So the difference is that all gardens have a theme because all gardens have a function and they have form. So everything in this world has form. And that's why you have this form as when you're defining elements of a theme and then the function of it. Not all gardens have a well-defined style, but many of them do. So for example, you could say, well, I'm going to do maybe a Victorian, more romantic garden, and that actually, depending on the time period, might be a more geometric. The form of it might be more geometric, but it would still probably have a lot of color in it. Um, and you might say, I'm going to do a tropical garden as my style, but the theme is going to be for pollinators. I'm going to really emphasize plants for pollinators, but it's going to look very tropical. So those are ways that you can say that some of these styles are connected. Many of these styles are connected to one of these themes that are listed here. So let's look at some examples. I have some photos here of different gardens. And I'm going to start out with the traditional cottage garden because we're all pretty familiar with that. And so you can see in these photos here, some of the elements that tell you, hey, this is a cottage garden and it looks very traditional. The theme, of course, for this one is having a lot of colorful flowers. So some of the elements you will see is an abundance of flowering plants. A lot of times a traditional picket fence. Two of these have the white picket fence. This one over on the left here, you can barely see the fence on that one. Um, and then, and or some other type of fence or surrounding element for the garden. And maybe a slightly messy, kind of little bit of a chaotic feel, but a very lush, heavily, densely planted feel. And that's your kind of your traditional cottage garden. And these images I'm going to show you were taken, they're not all Florida images, obviously. Like two of these gardens are in California, and one of them is up in, let's see, Buffalo, New York, I think is where I took that one. And so the reason why I'm using pictures from all different places is just because those are where I traveled and got, good pictures of these different styles. So here's another style. It's kind of what I call the cottage bungalow style. And this one in particular is all Florida pictures. It's Florida tropical as the theme. So we do have flowering plants, but you typically may not see as many flowering plants, but you will see a lot of tropical and a lot of green and a lot of lush plants if you're going for that Florida tropical cottage look. You might see a variety of different types of fences. And a lot of the houses, and that's why I put this cottage bungalow, is have a front porch on them. So when you go into these kind of new neighborhoods where they're putting the front porch and, these small neighborhoods like this one up in the upper right, that was in a neighborhood, I think, south of St. Augustine here in Florida. And so these are just some examples of what I would consider to be a cottage style with that Florida kind of tropical look to it. But here's the opposite one, kind of. It's still cottage bungalow style, but this one is, these were all taken in California. This would be kind of a California arid, I think, or desert style as opposed to, the tropical style. But still flowering plants. A lot more plants that look more evergreen and shrub-like, perhaps. But a variety of different ground covers here, and a lot of them have the stones in them, or pavers in them, or gravel, or mulch. So a little bit different ground cover. And usually, again, a front courtyard or garden walls and or a front porch. So this bottom picture, you can see the different, a garden wall that separates two levels of the garden, and another one, the top one, with a kind of a front courtyard feel. What's really interesting about these pictures is I took them all in one neighborhood, the same neighborhood in Sacramento, California. And so they all have a very kind of dry or arid look to them, but very close to this neighborhood. In fact, in the picture on the bottom, if you look in the distance, you'll see a lot of trees. That's a very high dike that is built, and on the other side of that is the American River, which is a river that originates in the Sierra Nevadas, a very large river. And so this is a delta area. The soils, the alluvial soils, go about a mile deep. And but they still, in this entire neighborhood, are trying to do very good soils, but water conservation type landscapes, drought tolerant landscapes here. Okay, so the next one, classic Japanese style. And the theme on this one is very traditional. You always pretty much in every traditional Japanese garden you go to would be like the stone lantern, stone pathways with different patterns and different materials, um, and then having other stone and gravel in the landscape. A lot of times there's a water feature, like this one in the top middle, a pond with a little waterfall in it, and bridges. You almost always see some type of a bridge in a traditional Japanese garden. Almost all of these pictures were taken at the Japanese garden in London, in Kew Gardens. But here's another take on a Japanese style. So this one is a contemporary theme of Japanese. And the kind of funny thing about this one is I took these pictures on a garden walk in Buffalo, New York, and it was a very Victorian. You can barely see it in the top photo. The house was a very old Victorian style, but the homeowner told me she really loved Japanese gardens, so she had him do a contemporary Japanese garden in front of her Victorian home. But anyway, instead of a stone lantern, they have a metal lantern in the upper left corner there. Wood pathways again with gravel, stones in the garden. There's also a water feature. So you see that pillar of granite in the top picture that actually has water bubbling out the top and flowing down and recirculating. So it was a very interesting juxtaposition of having this very modern, contemporary Japanese style garden with this very old Victorian house. But it worked. It was great. So here's another Spanish colonial style. So again, we're looking back at this colonial time period, and it's very traditional, a lot of elements. The theme is more kind of naturalistic in some ways. Three-tiered fountains were very, used very often in courtyards, in these Spanish courtyards. A lot of colorful tile. You can see that in the one large photo on the right. That one was taken in Santa Barbara, California, which if you've been there, it's a very beautiful city with all the Spanish colonial red tile roofs and buildings. It's one of my favorite cities, and I'm really jealous of them because they can grow all these spectacular succulents that we can't grow here, and you see them everywhere. A lot of container plants. So the other three photos here were taken in St. Augustine, where they have an abundance of Spanish colonial style, and so container plants, gated walls, courtyards, and so forth. So this is that kind of historic Spanish colonial. And the theme, you might even call the theme a historic theme, but it does have more of a naturalistic feel to it. So this style, a whimsical, playful style, and this is one that I typically find more in people's backyards, where they want to really personalize their backyard and do something really fun, and especially if they have kids, and also be unique and unusual, kind of is the theme. So it might be based on fantasy, a book or some movie that they saw. The picture on the right is from Harry Potter. It was, I guess, a garden shed that they saw in a Harry Potter movie and kind of replicated it in their backyard. Also, might be some historical touches, or you might see some more playful murals, paintings on fences, for example, and decorative items like the fish fountain. Whoops. Go in the wrong direction here. Like the fish fountain in the middle. and or the decorative elements there. So tropical style. So that one, obviously, very Florida. We see it all over, especially in South Florida. Maybe not a lot of these plants up here in Gainesville and in North Florida, but the theme is usually very naturalistic. An abundance of plants and looking very lush, a lot of greenery. Um, a lot of green, but also a little bit of color in the foliage and some flowers. But in particular, you see a lot more large, bold, and coarse texture plants because of, having more like palms and palm type plants and plants with very big leaves with deep veins, or the bromeliads with a very coarse texture. So those are some of the hallmarks that you would see of a tropical style. Um, and it's not just here in Florida. The picture on the far right is a picture from a garden in Hawaii, and but all the others are here in Florida. So here's another style, Victorian, and this one is back in Buffalo on the Garden Walk, a whole bunch of Victorian houses there. So this kind of Victorian style, but it's a contemporary version of a Victorian style, and this idea that there's these grand walkways that come up to this very grand porch and the stairs and so forth, more geometric forms. Um, Parking kind of courtyards, or a courtyard that where people can actually park there, and or just be a welcoming front courtyard. And this idea of these clipped hedges and then exuberant, kind of flowers. So the contemporary part here is the raised beds on this one, particularly this front yard, raised beds, but then that little touch of historical with the round clipped hedge in the middle, and then the flowers growing up. And then especially, it's a little hard to see, but there is a very large urn type container with the large tropical plant coming out of it. So this shows a way that you can still kind of honor the Victorian style of the house, especially with the plant material, and some of the ways the plant material is arranged and organized, but still be very contemporary with, the pavers in the front and so forth. Here's a mid-century modern style. This particular house is here in Gainesville. We have a fair number of mid-century modern homes in Gainesville. And the theme, of course, is geometric. There's just a lot of squares in this particular design here, starting with that rectangular, very simple rectangular pool, and then the walkway with the squares and all of the different levels of steps and squares in the river rock there. So you usually see in these mid-century modern, bold, large scale plants, and a minimal plant palette. So they don't use a lot of plant material. It would look pretty much totally opposite of a cottage garden. A lot of river rock, mulch, and gravel. Sculptures were also very prevalent in mid-century modern. So mid-century modern is that time period, in the 50s, originated mostly in California. You actually see a lot more of the mid-century modern gardens there. But for example, this kind of geometric sculpture in the on the side of the house, and or the bowl with all the succulent plants in it, are more typical of the mid-century modern style. So this one is going to be interesting because it is kind of a desert Southwest style. The look to it, a lot of drought tolerant plants. So it's based mostly on plant type, and that's, plants that don't need a lot of water. No turf in these landscapes, a lot of mulch, a lot of stones, and so forth. But the interesting thing is that 3 of these pictures are here in Florida, 2 of them in Gainesville and 1 in Orlando, and there's only 1 in California here. And you can probably guess which one that is, and that's the center, the photo in the center. That was taken in California. Um, but the top 2 photos on either side were in Gainesville. And you can see a lot of mulch there, some stone, some gravel. And the other one, actually, some of you may recognize, that was a small garden in Orange County at the extension office there, where they had some a lot of drought tolerant plants, agave and so forth. But all tending more toward that kind of Southwest, desert Southwest style. Um, that has been actually brought over here to Florida. So um, that's one that you don't see too often here. So this style that I wanted to show you was kind of the romantic style. And this one in particular is a very traditional romantic style. 2 of these pictures were taken in Paris. The other 2 actually in Buffalo. But the interesting thing is there's usually a lot of structures. For example, this gazebo here, which was in the backyard on our garden tour in Buffalo. But the gazebo came from Paris. The owner had purchased it there and had it shipped over here and rebuilt in their backyard. So it has a very Parisian flair to it. And you can see in that same yard that they had a water feature, with some koi in it. And you can see the gazebo up in the corner. Um, the romantic style is quite organized, but it feels natural, pretty natural, just the plant material. There's a lot of pathways, usually potted plants and so forth, like these trees. I think there were lemon trees in a park there, and in these very traditional wood planters. And this pathway with the border wall, the little border fence, very ornate, um, but it gives it a kind of a special romantic look to the garden. So now we're going to switch over and look mostly at themes. And here's a wildlife pollinator garden theme. But you could say that the style is cottage or whimsical too, because of some of the elements in it. And you'll see pollinators, colorful flowers, many different varieties of plants in these gardens. A lot of native plants, obviously, if you want to attract the pollinators. And then also small shelter structures. So the birdhouse that you see there. And then in the bottom right is a bee condo or a bee shelter with areas for bees to build their nests and so forth. But and the picture in the middle is actually that was at the Jacksonville Zoo, and actually is just, I think, a symbol of the garden to say this is a garden for pollinators. And you can see a bunch of the plants there have little name tags on them so people could learn more about the plants. So here's another theme that you will see a lot, and that's a plant-based theme. The style here on most of these that I'm showing are naturalistic, but it actually could be just about any style. You could make it very formal with plants. You could put the plants in a grid, for example, and make a kind of like pathways with a grid pattern and raised beds and everything. But since the only thing that they're really basing the theme on is that there are certain types of plants in the garden. So for example, the one at the upper left is a grass garden. And Here's another garden on the upper right. That garden was in that same neighborhood in California. And you can see that it's a shrub garden. So it really doesn't have any perennials so much in it, or even a lot of trees, but a lot of shrubs in the garden. Uh, and I just threw this one on the bottom here on the bottom left. That's actually a very famous garden that some of you have probably been to, and it's Monet's garden in France. And I put that one in there because within the larger garden, this is the color garden. So the plants there are almost all perennials, and they are all very colorful, and they're always in bloom, hence the name, the color garden. And the interesting thing about that garden is I was there with my students, and we had a chance to talk to the head gardener, who actually is from England. But he was telling us that they actually switch out those plants in that color garden on a rotating basis, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, to make sure that there are always flowering plants in there, regardless of what time of year it is. And that's because they have a certain image that they have to maintain in that garden for the visitors. And since it's called the color garden, there always has to be color in it so that the visitors, no matter what time of year, can see it and say, yes, I was in the color garden in Monet's garden. And so that's an interesting way to kind of keep your plant-based color flower garden going all year round. And then the other picture was again, from the garden in Orange County. So a plant-based garden can have a lot of different sizes, a lot of different forms, a lot of different colors, but it's one type of plant, like a grass or maybe a cactus again, or succulents or shrubs, even though it can have a variety of species within that type of plant. And then there's the water garden, and a lot of times a water garden that could be the focal point, usually. It could be many different styles. It could be historic. The one on the right is actually from the Japanese garden in the Jacksonville Zoo and Botanical Garden. And it could be very contemporary. It could be very naturalistic looking, old world, traditional. So there's many different ways you can incorporate water into your garden, but it's usually the focal point, and that's the theme. It's the thing that you want really to be the most important part of your garden. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the design process now, about how you go about the steps that you take. And I, put this cover of the Fine Gardening magazine in, and it talks about how design ideas originate. So that's kind of what we are going to talk about here. And first of all, you have to have inspiration. You have to be inspired by something, and you can get inspiration from many different things. And I'm going to walk you through a garden that my students just did for my class here in a minute. So for your inspiration, you really need to come up with a style or a theme. And it could be based on the architecture of the building, of the house. It could be, again, regional. We just went through all the different themes or styles you could choose from. You have to know when you talk to the client, or you may be the client, so when you're talking to yourself, what kind of activities and uses that you want in the garden, because that could help you decide what theme or style you want. Spatial definition, you have to think about the forms that you want to have. So again, it could be very geometric, it could be very naturalistic. And then you come up with a concept plan and your color scheme. And then you can decide what features and materials you want to use. And you're always going back to your inspiration, to your style or your theme when you're choosing that color or you're choosing the features. Like, are you going to have, you know, gravel paths or stone paths, or, um, you know, are you going to have garden walls, raised beds, and so forth? And then you can choose your plant material, again, going back to the style or the theme that you have decided on, and then you do your final plan. So this is an example of a design that one of my students did a few years ago, actually. And for the inspiration, our client had a mid-century modern house, but they were a traveler. They did a lot of travels. So in talking to the client, we asked them about gardens they'd seen in their travels. If they had some artwork that they showed us and some photos. You can also get inspiration, for example, out of magazines or books. We go on the internet, we look on different websites. I'm sure all of you have looked for, you know, different garden ideas on different websites. Um, and again, this was a mid-century modern house. You could use the hobbies that your client has, or your hobbies, your favorite plants. Um, you know, if you want it to be low maintenance or support wildlife, all those things can inspire you. So this student actually found this page in a garden magazine, and that was her inspiration for this design. And you can see in the design how she pulled different images from this page into the design. So you'll see these colors here reflected in her plant material down here. And also this in the bowls, the red color in the plant material here, and the greens and yellows even in the bowls and the chinaware, and kind of the oranges and reds in the furniture also. So this was her kind of like mood board or theme board that she took her inspiration from. So on this particular house we did here in Gainesville, they wanted a resort. They wanted it for entertainment, a lot of fun. It's in a neighborhood that's within walking distance of the stadium on campus here. So all sorts of barbecues and game day parties and so forth. But the owner wanted a really classic, timeless style, and she had been to Paris and wanted some hints of Paris in that design. So she wanted a fire pit, a bunch of chairs in the back, a place to play games, some hammocks, no turf. Didn't want to have to take care of turf. The challenge was parking for 6 to 8 cars, and they had an old storage shed in the back that we had to keep. So the one picture that she showed me for her inspiration was she wanted the house to be white with black trim and have a blue door. This was the house that we started with. So obviously it's not a white house. No black trim. You know, it's just kind of, I guess you might call it a little bit of a bungalow style, maybe. Traditional red brick. You can see the kind of the ornate column, wrought iron column on the corner, a house from the 50s. And here's the backyard. The students are walking around taking measurements and so forth. Um, and this was actually had been a covered porch, I think, at one time that was enclosed, and an old barbecue fire pit that was she wanted to take out completely, get rid of that. So I put together an inspiration board for her, showing her pictures of different ways that the patio and fire pit could be designed. And the forms that we were thinking of using in the back were more circular and square, using more pavers and tile around the area, having a seat wall. Wanted to show her what it could look like with some raised planters, and possibly even have a trellis with some swings, basket seats, or the hammocks in them. So we started out with that, and this seat wall was what she really liked, so we decided to incorporate that into the design. Here's some more kind of the classic style, a little bit of that black and white stripe, Paris feel as the color scheme, and some pops of blue in there and some bright greens to make that black and white really show up well. And I also showed her this picture of this wall with the painted side of the wall for the kind of area where the fire pit was going to go, which she really liked because she wanted to put that to reference the blue front door. So on our plant list, the backyard is full shade, a huge, massively huge oak tree, full shade. And so I just showed her actually some pictures from my own house, the shade garden that I have. And we also, and I told her, I showed her the picture. I said, let's go to the nursery. We'll get a cart and we'll throw some plants on it and come up with some plants and, you know, a color scheme and so forth. So this was the concept plan that we started with, you know, and this is the front yard here. And this was the brick house here and the front door that you saw. And we came up with this idea to do a paver courtyard in the front and then a pretty wide concrete driveway. And the idea came from this inspiration of this design you saw earlier. I showed her this picture and she really liked that idea of having pavers coming right up to the front door there. And in the back, we came up with a raised seat wall, a gravel area with the fire pit and the 8 chairs and some umbrellas, covering an area in the back for a covered back porch. And then her thought was originally she wanted to park some cars in the back going through this gate, through the carport. I totally nixed that idea. I said, no, let's not do that because this big black dot here over in the image on the left is the massive oak tree. And I said, I can't get on board with parking cars under your oak tree. You just do not want to do that. So this was the final plan that we came up with. And I didn't have time to put some color on it, but you can see that in the front, there's a large paver courtyard here. And this is just a paver border to distinguish the courtyard from the driveway. And you can see that there's room for 4 cars in the gravel area alongside the driveway, 2 cars in the carport, and we can park 2 to 3 more cars over here in the paver courtyard if needed. No turf, all plant material here in the front. Oops, let me go back there one. And then in the backyard over here on the left side here is that seat wall, the fire pit. We have string lights. That's what these kind of weird looking light lines are. String lights above it. A couple of hammocks off to the side. And you can see the cornhole way over to where the large oak tree is, where she wanted to park the cars, and that was a big no there. And just all plant material in the back. So they're in the process of installing it right now. So this is in the back, that's an old shed that she's thinking about having a mural painted on it. But we put pavers in instead of gravel. There's the fire pit and the chairs. And you can't see them that well, but under the lip of this seating wall is some downlights. And they are going to paint that blue. So at night, it'll have a nice blue, light blue kind of line around there. And kind of light up the area there. And here's the front of the house. This was just shortly after it was planted, so you can tell it's newly planted. And we had this terrible heat wave here, and some of the plants looked like they were a little stressed by the heat. But you can see the courtyard, paver courtyard there, and just going right up to a wider front door. It's no longer red brick, it's white with black trim. And the door is yet to be painted blue, I think. And they are still going to put a bench in the front under the window and some very large planters over by the carport. Some very colorful blue planters there. Oops. Let's see. So I think that's it. Yes, and I think I'm about out of time. So thank you. And any questions?
Okay, yes, I'm back and we do have a couple of questions. We only have two, so if you guys have any more, go ahead and get them in that Q&A box. So first is a FFL question. Are stones or lava rocks okay in an FFL garden?
So yes, they are, but not in large amounts. So I would use them only for pathways, and we do use a lot of pathways to actually define the edge of plant beds. So I try to confine those mostly to your pathways. I do like to use though like large boulder size. We call them boulders here in Florida. They're not really boulders if you compare them to other parts of the country in size, but like the limestone rocks, I like to use a lot of those in a Florida-friendly landscape because it gives a different texture, a different color, and a different form for contrast. But I wouldn't substitute mulch, for example, with a lot of gravel or stone. And I'm sure you have all seen some pictures of yards where that's all they have in the front yard. Especially if it's that white rock that seems to be somewhat popular here in Florida. Uh, I remember once I got a photo of a yard which was nothing but white rock, and they were asking if it could be certified as a Florida-friendly yard. And we really just said no. You need some more plants here to be a
Why
Florida.
why is that, Gail? Why don't we say it's Florida friendly with stones or rocks for mulch?
Because of lack of biodiversity mainly. It's not biodiverse enough. It doesn't have anything to support wildlife, and that's one of the 9 principles to support pollinators. Um, and, you know, a lot of times people will say, but I'm not using a lot of water. And that's true, but that's not the only principle of a Florida-friendly landscape to use less water. There needs to be more plant material and more biodiversity there.
And I will say, my husband is a landscaper and he doesn't want to touch the gravel because the weeds grow through. And it is a huge pain. You just have to like consistently herbicide forever. So it's great for paths. It's great for drip lines as well, like from it coming off your roof. So
Mhm.
the rain doesn't splash. Okay, so
Yeah.
now we got a bunch of questions. We got 23 questions now. We started out with 2. Okay,
Okay.
so let's look here. Can you talk more about shade plants? Perhaps recommend a few that are tall, medium, and short.
Well, in what part of Florida? Because there's different plants for north, central, and south. I'm more familiar with plants in North Florida, obviously, because I'm here in Gainesville, but um, I don't know. I mean,
We don't
ferns for
know.
one, and there's probably different ferns that can be grown in all parts of Florida. So I would go with ferns. I have bromeliads in my garden. And some people ask me, well, aren't those mosquito magnets? I don't have a problem with that in my garden. I don't know. It might be more in South Florida, possibly where it's warmer and more humid, but I don't have a problem with the bromeliads in my garden. Gingers, I have a lot of gingers. I have like philodendron, the Xanadu philodendron in particular, and caladiums, and those are just bulbs and they just come up every year. I let them, obviously, they just die back in the winter, but they come up every year in the summer. Um, so those are a few off the top of my head that I can think of.
Okay, let's look. Are there any books you suggest for homeowners to get for inspiration and ideas?
Well, there are a lot of books, but one of my favorite little books is called The Good Yard, and it's actually by Billy Goodnick, I think is his last name. And it's a tiny little book, but it's a great little book. A lot of ideas in there, a lot of helpful hints. I think it only costs like $14 on Amazon. And he is a designer, so he takes you through the process, a lot of pictures. Um, so that's one of my favorite.
Okay. What are your thoughts on pool ponds in a naturalistic, Florida-friendly yard? Are those common in
What was it? A pool pond? Can you repeat the question?
Um, what are your thoughts on pool ponds in naturalistic, Florida-friendly yard? Are those common
Actually,
in
I don't
Florida?
I don't think I've ever seen one in Florida. I have seen one in some other parts of the country. Um, I don't know that I would have one in Florida because of the wildlife that it would attract. I would be more concerned about more snakes possibly, and maybe even gators coming into a pool like that. So a pool pond, if I'm using the same term correctly, is a pool that you can swim in, but it has usually on one end of it or the other or a side, it will have a littoral shelf with a ledge with plant material in it, and that plant material is the filter for the water. So it's a very natural pool. It's not, it doesn't have chlorine or anything in it. The water is cleaned by the plant material, but I can't imagine that it wouldn't attract certain wildlife that you wouldn't want in your pool. So,
That's also been my thought. If there is a body of water, a gator will find it.
yes.
Okay, well, here's an interesting question. I'm going to do a few more. Um, we see the cottage garden has a lot of flowers kind of bunched together.
Uh-huh.
But in this person's experience in Orlando and the humidity, having the plants tight that close together promotes viruses and
Mhm.
it's kind of lacks airflow. So, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, that is an issue here in Florida because of the high humidity. And I think that you can still do that cottage style. Make it a little bit more contemporary though. That's kind of your out. You can just say, okay, my style is gonna be sort of cottage, but I'm gonna lean toward a more contemporary one and make smaller groups, like maybe only 3 plants kind of bunched together. And you can kind of use this as the rule, for attracting pollinators. Jarrett Daniels has told us many times that you have to have an area at least or a group of plants at least 3 foot by 3 foot with flowers on them to attract your pollinators, because they don't have very good vision. And so you need a big enough splash of color. So you could maybe use that, put 3 plants kind of close together, leave some gaps, walkable, like little footpaths, and put another clump of flowering plants together and kind of space them out that way. So it's not spaced like one plant and then farther away one plant and farther away one plant. Do little clusters of plants, but then leave these kind of pathways that you could think of as a river of air could go through there to let a little more air in. And so the problem is when the air is stagnant and the humidity is there, um, then that's where you get, different issues with it.
Okay, I also have this question. What are your thoughts on mixing styles or themes on a single property? Are there strategies for making multiple styles work better together if you like different ones and want to incorporate more variety in your landscape?
So one of the things that I do a lot is because sometimes homeowners can't decide really they want two different kind of styles or themes, is you can make the front yard completely different from the backyard. Um, and the front yard, the only thing you have to remember there is that's the public facing garden. And so you probably want to have a style that you can keep a little bit neater, a little bit cleaner. We all want to be good neighbors and have a nice looking front yard. It's social norms in your neighborhood and so forth. So maybe that's a little bit more of a contemporary style there where there, might not be um, uh, as many plants, so it's lower maintenance and you can keep it good looking all the time. And then in the backyard, just go for it and put a lot of plants because unless you entertain a lot in your backyard, you're the one that looks at it mostly. Um, I do. So, for example, another one that I get a lot of requests for is a Japanese style with a kind of a tropical flair to it. And so we do a mashup. We kind of take some of the elements of a Japanese garden, like the lantern, for example, maybe a little water feature, and we throw those in there and we arrange the plants like it might look more like a Japanese garden, but they're tropical plants. So somebody might recognize the theme as being Japanese, but they're going, but these plants are not usually the plants you see in a Japanese garden, and you know, that's what happens when you do a mashup. But you still get the feel of if you put a nice little bridge in and a little water feature and a stone lantern and maybe even have a little pagoda Zen type feel to it. Um, so that's how you can mix too. And we actually get a lot of requests for that here in Florida.
Okay, everybody. Well, it is noon. Thank you so much for your questions and thank you so much for attending today. I'm actually putting a couple of links in our chat box and these are links to our plant app, the FFL plant app. I saw a lot of questions of people looking for specific plants for their yards.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, Florida is so diverse and variable that plants that work well in a shady yard in North Florida just are not going to do the same in South Florida. So
Right.
with the plant app, you can filter for your climate zone. You can filter for flowering plants, shrubs, trees, large trees, small trees. And you can also filter for different site conditions in your yard. So that is a really great place to start looking. If you have more questions about Florida-friendly plants, another great place to contact is your local county extension office. And we say this all the time in IFAS, contact your local county extension. But you can do that. You can call and you can say, I have this in my yard and I want it to change, or this is doing well, or this isn't doing well. And if you call your office and ask for the horticultural agent, you can get some good answers. I'll put another link, or maybe somebody else on the call can put a link you can find your local county extension contacts. I also put a list of Florida-friendly landscaping certified professionals. These are all maintenance companies, landscape designers. We have, all kinds of professionals in the state that have gone through our Florida-friendly training. And so they are familiar with Florida-friendly concepts and our principles, and that's a really good place to start. Okay, and then Becky also just put in the chat how to find, oh yeah, we got both of them. You can look up your extension agent by county, and you can either look for your Florida-friendly landscaping specialist in your county or the horticultural agent, and they'll be able to help you out. So thank you so much, Gail, for joining us today, and we will see everyone at our next webinar.
All right. Thank you, everyone.